within Cuba, not just in Havana.
Recording is on.
Thank you. Not just in Cuba, not just in Havana, in Cuba more generally, and scholars of Cuba from outside. And for that to be a productive dialogue. So the works that will be published in this book series can be in Spanish or English or both, if it's an edited collection. And they won't necessarily always have to be academic articles. They could be fiction, they can be creative work as well. So we're keeping it as broad as possible in order to give as much space as possible to the many Cubas and the many Cuban studies that exist across the world. Okay, that's my announcement over. So many of you will have heard us talk about Granma. We're not going to be talking in detail about our project, but really we're talking today about how we have been forced to rethink our own work on the basis of starting the Granma project. And there you can see a map, you can see the triangulation that was the basis for our project with Bayamo, the capital of the province, Manzanillo on the coast, and right down there in the triangle, the point of the triangle between the two, Bartolomé Massó in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra. Those were the three municipalities that we've used for our project. I'll speak for myself. It's been the most fascinating and joyful process to work in Granma, but it's also been a very long and painful process for me to start to decolonize my own thinking. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. We started in 2014. We started a little bit before that. And Delio Orozco, who's here with us today, was one of the very first people who reminded us of the need to decolonize our thinking. In one of the first focus groups we had, Delio asked us if the people who were going to be providing information, perspectives, data, expertise, wisdom, and knowledge were going to be the subjects or the objects of this research project. And I remember being taken a little bit aback, but that has been such a useful lesson for both of us. I also remember the very first time we went to Granma, Tony and I, to do some exploratory research and talk to people. And I said to Tony at the end of the day, when we were in Bartolomé Massó, that had this been a part of Latin America where there was a significant indigenous population, I mean, an ethnically indigenous population, strongly ethnically indigenous population, it would have been very easy to romanticize what was happening in the Sierra Maestra, for example, and to talk about cultures of resistance. Cuba, however, forces us to think in much more complex ways about relationships of power, relationships of center and periphery. So, Tony, I'll pass over to you.
Yeah. Because we started with trying to work out how the national narratives and policies were playing out in the localities, and of course everything turned out to be much more complex than that. And I was well aware that when I came across one of the places we will look at, particularly Bartolomé Massó, where there wasn't a history written, where there was no one had actually, well, someone had started it, but had never finished it, that I wanted to take that over and write the history for them. And I had to stop myself over and over again from doing that. Because it kept forcing me to think, but they are telling their story. We must let them tell their story and not me. So that's one similarly painful experience I had, was to rethink the way I approached history.
And when Tony says tell the story, we're going to put that in a sort of a counterpoint against to write the story, and we'll come to that in a second. So different forms of dissemination and how they might be more or less seen as being central or peripheral. So this is just a very, very condensed summary, but there are some orthodoxies about the uses of culture and history from outside Cuba and inside Cuba. And we put in the title National ? Or Havana, but certainly what they are a partial view of how culture and history happen across the island. So those of us who work in literary studies, especially cultural studies more broadly, will recognize some of these points on the left. Outside Cuba, there seems to be, and in fact, Ambrosio Fornet wrote extensively about the Egyptologists of the Cuban Revolution, the tendency to get stuck in time with Cuba and Cuban culture, and to focus predominantly on aspects which of course exist, but to focus predominantly on aspects such as the siege mentality, the idea of culture being used for moral coercion or history being used as political propaganda, that culture and history are used to repress or to force a consensus that might not necessarily exist, that Cuba is in many ways characterized by cultural underdevelopment, and we'll come back to that, that history books and cultural texts are often overly didactic, and of course we all know the last one, that they bear the characteristics of Sovietization, Stalinization, or the rigidity of Marxist thought. Do you want to add anything there?
No, I think that that's going to lead comfortably to some of the other things we're going to talk about in terms of the outside Cuba. But particularly, you're right, that political propaganda is the one that constantly is the accusation laid at Cuban historians from outside, which is to say they're following a narrative, an established narrative, and everything fits that narrative.
So inside Cuba, there are equally orthodoxies as there are everywhere. And again, it's not to say that any of these are inaccurate or wrong. It's just to say that these are the tropes that are repeated again and again, that culture and history are used as instruments of national sovereignty and of nation building. They are indicators as well as constructors of development. So the kind of opposite of the cultural underdevelopment argument, that they are important aspects of anti-colonial and anti-imperial projects, that they contribute to the project of social justice, especially through the dissemination of text through printing, etc. They contribute to a sense of egalitarianism, and they lead of course, as Martí would say, they lead to the freedom of the Cuban citizen. So it's not to say that any of the points on the left or the right are wrong or are inaccurate. It is simply to say that these are the tropes that are repeated again and again about Cuba, about Cuban history, about Cuban culture. And our question for ourselves visiting Granma was, is this really the full national picture? Is this the complete, most complex national picture? Or is it a picture that really emanates from Havana? Sorry, as we slow down.
Sorry. So I'll start with my particular dimension, which was looking at history. And I came to assuming there is a national narrative, even though I know now quite clearly that that national narrative is constantly undergoing change. But nonetheless, there is one, the same as there is in Britain with curriculum in history, history curriculum in schools and so on, that there was a narrative, and to see how local histories in Granma province built on or departed from or adapted the narrative. And using the three locations, we looked at the three places. Now, it was obvious that Bayamo had all the advantages you could want because it was the capital, it has a university, one of the campuses of the university, it has the official Oficina del Historiador de la Ciudad, it has Ediciones Bayamo, provincial press, one of the standard ones, it has the Casa de la Nacionalidad, which of course is the site, one of the sites of the Dia de la Cumanía every year. I also should have mentioned it has Ventana Sur and Demajagua newspapers where people can publish, and it has a provincial archive, exactly as you would expect it. So that's where you would expect history to be written. Manzanillo is interesting, of course, and Delio's presence here will confirm all that, because yes, it also has a university campus where there are historians. Mostly, I think I'm right in saying that it was originally the pedagogic side of the university. But it has a thriving municipal archive, and that's unusual. And Delio is partly responsible for that. It has, therefore, also an unofficial city historian, Delio himself, but is widely recognized as the historian. And certainly no one has written more about Manzanillo in recent years than him. But again, it has its own press. It has Editorial Orto. So already Granma is unusual in having two places that have some of those same benefits, but clearly there's an inequality between the two of them. And then there's Bartolomé Massó. Bartolomé Massó will say, simply for the moment, it is a small sugar town, literally in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra, at the end of the Llano and the start of the mountains. And we chose it partly because it seemed very typical. Well, we soon find out quite how atypical it was.
Let me just move on.
And so what I started by doing was saying, all right, look, let's just ask lots of questions. And one of the questions we asked was, how do you identify yourselves in each place? We came up with everybody came up with surprising answers, but very revealing ones. But one of the things we asked, or I asked particularly, which was, come on, in which period of Cuban history do you feel reflects your place more than any other? Now, in Bayamo, it was easy because it was 1868. It was the first city to be taken by the rebels and was the site of the first government. So that was logical. But it's interesting how much that does dominate the memorialization in the city itself. 1868 is clearly even more present than 1895, for example. So that was it. Manzanillo was an interesting one because, of course, that's also where Demahagua is. It was also where the first villa was set up until it was moved to Bayamo. So there were several options. But on one particular occasion, we asked that question, and the group answering the questions said fairly clearly early 20th century, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, when Manzanillo was booming, when Manzanillo was an industrial center, and above all was a cosmopolitan cultural center as well. That's when Orto began. The interesting one was Masson, because they made it clear it was 1957 to 58. That was the period, the last year and last 2 years, and actually it went on to 1960 of the rebellion and the early revolution. And there are reasons for that, very clear reasons. The main reason being actually that in 1958 is when of course, the last battles of the insurrection took place, many of them within what is now the municipio of Masson. But also, interestingly, and this is why we discovered that Masson wasn't that typical, that what happened in 1959-60 was that many of the combatientes came back from Havana and to build the Ciudad Escolar, the first trabajo voluntario in Cuba, the project of Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara back in 1958, but also they stayed. And so it became a very unusual municipio indeed. Now, coming back to the Bayamo and Manzanillo, as I said, inequality between them quite clearly. And well, Manzanillo was certainly aware of that. Bayamo isn't always, but it certainly is there. And they have a fairly good, solid record of publications, books, articles, and I should mention all sorts of other things as well, because the articles come in all sorts of different places. And the fact that there is a city historian is an important one there. So that you could actually easily work out the historiography of Bayamo and Manzanillo. Now, Manzanillo is interesting because they also have, again, coming back to Delio, they also have an encyclopedia, an online encyclopedia. And that clearly is something that when we arrived there, no one else had. And that really was very significant because it gave them an option which certainly the others didn't have. Now, thanks to Delio, that is actually changing a little bit, but nonetheless, that was unusual. But in one meeting with the Manzanillo historians, when we were asking them about their own research and how they focused on it and what was their role, I asked the question, how do you fit into the national narrative? And what came out of that was, and I have to admit that the phrase was mine, another brick in the wall, just simply quoting Pink Floyd, it was another brick in the wall. I said, is that true? And they said, yes, that's okay, that's true. And of course, I asked the question, but is it better than anybody else's brick? Are you, is there something different about it? And they were unclear about how to answer that, but that remained as a particular model for at least my thinking for a while. But that raised questions, which I'll pick up afterwards.
Oh, you're not going to go into your questions?
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
You're going to pick them up now.
Sorry. Whoops. I thought we'd planned this. Anyway, yes. The questions it raised were the following ones, and I think it moves into the wider questions. It raised in my mind the question, who is local history for? Who's actually going to benefit from local history? Is it for the local people in the locality? Is it for them to have a sense of identity? If so, then if it's just another brick in the wall, does it matter? I mean, is that really what you should be doing? Should they not be saying our brick is different to the neighboring brick? But if it's actually for more national recognition of the history that others are missing, then you have to say, if it's not written, then how visible is it? So it raised the question, not just for whom is local history being written, but Does it have to be written? Because Bartolomé Massot raised that very big question. There is no written history of Bartolomé Massot yet. It may well emerge thanks to Delio's encyclopedia for it. They have no press, no means of publishing or printing it, and no likelihood of any book of their history coming out soon. So it was unusual. And yet what was so clear, talking to people, focus groups, talking to groups of people, individuals, the very strong sense of their own communal history that they had.
So we might look at that, and everything that Tony said for history, I could equally say for culture. So we went to Manzanillo, we went to Bayamo, we met writers, we met editors, we met promotores culturales, and then we came to Massot, and we were told that there are no published literary texts from Massot, that they have never published a text, or at least since 1959, and they don't have access to a printing press, they don't really have access, and they weren't complaining about it. They have a word, it's a word that's used across Cuba for people who write and perhaps aren't published, and that is creador. So as we walked around Bartolomé Massot, we were introduced to the many creadores who write. They have in the Casa Cultura an asesor literario who goes to visit them every couple of weeks and makes a handwritten copy of the handwritten literature that these people have written, the creadores have written, and keeps them in a file. So we might look at that and say, as many writers, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial now, as many writers in Havana have said and will continue to say, ay, pobrecitos. I started by looking at the Historia de la Literatura Cubana, the 3 volumes, and the way that these 3 municipios, or what they were called across history, how they were referred to, and they're virtually absent other than in the terms in which they're recognized from the center, from Havana. And so we would say, ay, pobrecitos, and we would apply the deficit model. And for literature, this is using the very useful, incredibly useful work done by Pascal Casanova on the World Republic of Letters. This would say that there's little old Bartolomé Massot. You can see the images on the left take us from the Dirección Municipal de Cultura in Massot, that little building at the bottom, all the way up to Havana, and Havana as being synonymous with the nation. So it would tell us that Massot, to some extent, Manzanillo, to a less extent, Bayamo, are all looking in the direction of Havana. They are applying, using, following, or feeling obliged to follow and use the Havana model, which is synonymous with modernity, literary modernity in Cuba. And their aspiration, if only it could happen, would be to be as close to that Havana national model as possible. So that was my original thought, that this is what's happening. And we know that Cuba has a centralized model still to this day. And we know that in many senses, people refer to the verticalismo of the Cuban model in many areas of public life. So that's what I was expecting to understand. And I was expecting to be able to tell the story of these 3 municipios following that model. And then I think a little bit more. And this is why I say it was very painful. I think a little bit more and I say, but no, that's not right. That's not really what's happening, is it? So I'd try again. And I would say, okay, so it is a centralized model. It is a verticalist model. Everybody wants to be like Havana. So Havana is synonymous with nation. And the nation, the Cuban nation, is synonymous with modernity. And everybody wants to follow that. But from what I can see, the fact that Massot is not publishing, the Massot doesn't have the same kind of literary culture that Manzanillo as an urban literary commercial center and Bayamo as an urban political administrative center have, it's doing something slightly different. What is it doing? In its work in the community, its literary work in the community, it's looking across community and it's looking into its own community. So there was the second model, a national model with a tipping point. And where would you put that horizontal tipping point that says we start to look around and inside, down and into our own community rather than up to Havana and then on to the World Republic of Letters? A very, very difficult task and still not something that I was satisfied with. It seemed to sort of tick some boxes, but I know what was happening. So when I sat and looked at what was actually happening across the province, and we will go on to say that this is not necessarily Granma exclusively, this is how we might understand the periphery. We saw, in my case, methods of producing literature, but you could possibly, and I won't speak for you, Tony, but you could probably put history in there as well. Methods of producing literature or history and effects of literature and history, which are collective, which are multidimensional, which are intermedial, they use different media, are intermodal or multimodal, they're cumulative, they're relational rather than linear and singular, and they're probably most importantly oral and performative rather than published. They have, again, this is something that we could all think about, and in fact, some of the talks we've already had in the conference so far have touched on these areas. The effects of those texts, even when they're oral or performative, or perhaps because they are oral, performative, and collective, are affective, in other words, to do with the emotions, moral, and of course, cognitive rather than purely cognitive. And for me, most importantly, we know that the Cuban Revolution and its cultural policy has been about a radical experimentation with cultural forms. But the recognition for me is that experimentation is not only recognizable when it's aesthetic or genre-based. In the terms of literary studies or cultural studies, to understand experimentation in a much broader view. However, I kept getting drawn back to the view that predominates from the center, and a temptation, just to go back to the previous slide, to see something very romantic, to see something very unique, distinct, almost indigenous, you might say, certainly rural, about what was happening in Maso. And that said more about my expectations of a more romanticized view of less urban cultures, which has to do with expectations of the rural, the indigenous, etc. And somebody who said all of this much better than I, and who's thought through it much better than I, who I continue to go back to use, is Néstor García Canclini, who interestingly forms a huge part of the curriculum of the Carrera de Estudios Socioculturales, that is part of the municipalization of the universities in the Batalla de Ideas, and many of the people who now lead culture in these three municipalities and in many other municipalities in Cuba were educated with that particular reading list. So here's Néstor García Canclini with his wonderful sense of humor, who says about interculturality from the local, looking at it from the local. A menudo descubrimos, speaking as scholars, que los sorprendidos son los indígenas, los migrantes y los espectadores mediáticos, que nos ven llegar con preguntas y conceptos inapropiados para sus vidas actuales. And that's exactly where I got stuck, with preguntas and conceptos that were completely inappropriate for what I could see was actually happening in their lives. And he concludes that the periphery is not quite as peripheral as we might like it to be. The second bit in red there. Los nativos que estudiamos se parecen mucho a nosotros por la fluidez con que se apropian de múltiples patrimonios para redefinir sus diferencias, corregir las desigualdades y conectarse con el mundo. So this tipping point, wanting to look at Maso as being different, all of these things that we were seeing, if we were to look at them from the center, we would see them in a romanticized, objectified, atrophied, static way, rather than having the same agency and the same ability to negotiate and to enter and leave modernity that the rest of us have.
This is where I come back in, because the question that Maso really posed to me does history have to be written? Because it was clear that the Masoenses actually live their own history, perform their own history repeatedly. Performance was part of it very clearly. And they're constant reminders of their 121 sitios históricos. They're not alone in that. There are plenty of places that have that number, but they knew that. They celebrated a different day. They celebrated a different day of liberation. They had lots of combatientes there. There are lots of ways in which that history was being lived, repeated, and celebrated. So I wondered then, was the brick in the wall notion potentially meaningless? The other question, of course, is Bartolomé Maso that unique, as we began to think? I've said there's the story of over 100 other municipios. I actually did the count, and it's something like around 140 municipios whose history has not yet been written of the 169. And anyway, was I romanticizing the evidence? Did I actually think, well, actually, you don't have to write history, but what happens if you don't is the other question that raised. And I wondered, after this, the pandemic helped to make you rethink things. Is there another way to read it all? And that is to talk about the local history in all localities. What does it actually mean? Is it part of, and I think it is, to create a meaningful local identity based on a narrative of that locality where people really belong more than anything else? Most people belong to the place they actually live. And it's because I also think, because if there is a national narrative, however persuasive it is, it only works if everybody everywhere can identify with it. If you don't identify with it, it's just simply propaganda. And that identity is often easier at the local level to identify. So I've tried this with my own students in the past, and that was very clear. That's what they were aware of more than anything else. And it does bring us back to one of my old favorites, which is what I call the colonialist or the colonial dichotomy, which is where is the problem and where and who are the solution? What I mean by that is that all colonialism, and I'm including that neocolonialism, depend on a colonized mentality, on the colonized seeing themselves and accepting that they are the problem and the outsider, the colonizer, is the solution. Otherwise, you have to have troops. As simple as that. If you want to get to persuade people that they aren't right to be colonized, they're the problem. But there's a long, long process, of course, of that, which is anti-colonialism and decolonization before independence and inevitably after, is about reversing that dichotomy totally. The whole process of anti-colonialism, I think, is a very long, slow, painful process of rethinking the problem and rethinking the solution. And they aren't necessarily the same measure. And that anti-colonialism has often been very partial, very good at identifying the problem, but not necessarily how and why the people themselves might be the solution. And that brings me to something else, which is, well, what about local identity? Where is it more visible? It is visible and local, I think, because it really works there. And that might be one role for local history, however we record it, to have a narrative to which we, in locality, belong. And I wondered whether there is a historiographical dimension to that point about, in Fidel's Palabras a los Intelectuales, where he argued that Cubans had not just the right to culture, but they also had the ability to be cultural practitioners. Well, is it equally true then that they have the right to history, but also the right and the capacity to write in one form or other their collective history and not follow the established norms? And for that, I'll just come back very briefly to this Venn diagram, used by all sorts of people. It's been used by growth theorists, by dependency theorists. I used it once as well when I did a history of Havana culture. And I was looking particularly at that overlap between the global market and the cultural canon, which is A, and the colonized territory, which is historically Cuba. And the overlap was Havana. That was the question, was for whom were the Havana painters, composers, authors writing? Was it to be accepted in the global market, or was it to actually be accepted back at home? And I think the same thing happened to some extent with history, how you write history, how you record history. There's a global canon about how you do it. And then there's perhaps a Cuban canon, or at least there might be a Cuban canon. And the overlap was very clear. It was the version that was coming from Havana. So there's a comparison there. But when you bring it, what happened, of course, in the 1960s, there's a further complication where you've got the Western canonical view of how to write history. You've also got the Soviet bloc, the socialist bloc model coming in to complicate it. And I was very attracted by the idea when I read La Historia de los Historiadores, where the whole debate was about which school of history is correct, is which one should be following. And both of those schools of history were up in Europe. And therefore, that was very significant for me, because it does make us rethink what for whom is history being written?
Okay, to come back to literature, and we're going to finish fairly soon. So just as Tony was talking about those three there areas and how in many ways Cuba still had to look to Europe or looked to Europe for its methods of doing history, Cuban literature has also followed the rules of the game of literature since colonization. Who do we cite as our influences? Who do we recognize as our influences? And as we know, I know people like Izzy, people like Guy, people who've worked on Cuban culture will know that there are many influences, that Cuba has been so open to the world, not only as an island, but also as a peripheral colonized nation, not just Spanish, but to US influence, to Latin American influences, to the Third World influence, to the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, and more recently to the Global South. And since 1959, there was a very conscious intention and very specific intentional policy to decolonize Cuban culture and Cuban identity from those colonial and neo-colonial pasts through emphasizing massification, democratization, and decolonization. However, the question really is about internal decolonization. And in that sense, can we start to look at Cuban studies and the work that we do in Cuba and recognize the overbearing weight of either the national, the global, or Havana as the model, versus that potential which up till now seems to have been so wasted or so invisible of the local and the peripheral? And as Tony was saying for history, local history, in terms of culture, to see culture from the local, which is, after all, where most of our experience takes place. However much we're on Facebook or Instagram, most of our lives take place in a very local environment. And to ask the questions, honestly, who decides why the peripheral is peripheral? Sorry, why the peripheral is peripheral, and how do they decide that? And then maybe to take the next step and say what happens when we put the peripheral and the local at the center, when we start with what has been considered the peripheral and the local, but we start with that as the center for those people that inhabit that space. I think what I'm slowly and painfully moving towards is a model that lessens the risk of finding evidence that slots neatly into national and global frameworks. The kind of work, and this is without any disrespect to any of the great, now internationally known theorists from any part of the world, but the kind of work that wants to say, I'm going to take the theories of X or Y or Z from France or the UK or any other country or the US, and I'm going to slot Cuba into them. And not just slot Cuba. What do I mean when I say Cuba? I probably mean Havana. So when we put the peripheral and the local at the center, we can also provide new evidence for new concepts and new theories to be developed. And I'm not saying by any means that we're the only ones to be doing this. And we might find that the peripheral isn't quite as marginal or exceptional as we thought. In other words, we might discover that we are the majority peripheral. And just ask yourselves the question, if you're not convinced, does your own capital city, we have an international crew today, does your capital city represent you? So our lessons from Granma are to decolonize literary studies and historiography by putting the periphery at the center, to look at concepts and theories from the global south of what literature and history can mean, and why we need to find another word for the global activities of making literature or history. It might mean that act of decolonizing, structuring ideas that privilege local people, reflecting their identity, without always having to draw links to the national or the global for those ideas or those people to become visible or to feel visible. Decolonizing might mean creating kinds of authorship that privilege dialogue, collaboration, and Garcia Canclini's idea of interculturality, always with relations of power, but nevertheless not assuming singularity. We might think about dissemination methods that go beyond traditional print or publishing. We can talk about this in the questions and answers. And in particular, we might really try and force ourselves, and I'm talking about myself, and that's why it's been so painful, to develop or to borrow methods that try and correct what I'm going to ask Tony to pronounce it because his Portuguese is better than mine.
But it's something like Boaventura de Sousa Santos.
What he refers to as epistemological or cognitive injustice, colonized minds and ideas that keep global social, political, and economic injustices in place despite the apparent end of empire. And this is the really crucial point for both of us. That injustice that is being done by making or keeping invisible the majority of the world's activities. So we might learn local lessons from Granma for understanding the many other global peripheries in a non-reductionist or coercive way, and we may start to develop methods for what we might term cognitive justice. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to ask Delio if we just want to continue.
Ok, ¿me escuchan?
Sí, sí. Voy a seguir con la presentación entonces, Delio, un momento.
Ok.
Ya.
Bien, estos espacios de descolonización en la actual provincia Granma provienen de una realidad evidente, es el espacio en que vivimos. Se ha dicho con toda razón que mientras más viejo se vuelve el hombre, más conservador resulta. Sin embargo, a nosotros nos pasa todo lo contrario. Mientras más envejecemos, más rebeldes nos convertimos. Y eso tiene que ver con el peso del pasado, con el peso de la historia, con el peso del espacio en que vivimos. Desde el siglo XVII ya se hablaba de las diferencias entre el oriente y el occidente de Cuba. Después, el gran demógrafo cubano Juan Pérez de la Riva hablaría de la Cuba A y la Cuba B. En estos tiempos de globalización, pues ya no solamente hay Cuba A o Cuba B, hay Cuba A, B, C, D, y es posible que no nos alcance el abecedario para reconocer los distintos espacios en los que vive Cuba. Ahora bien, es importante que estos espacios, se sepa que estos espacios de descolonización, estos espacios de libertad y estos espacios de autorreconocimiento e identidad no provienen de elementos ideológicos o de elementos políticos, provienen del sentimiento de independencia y de soberanía. Construido la hipótesis o la tesis de que la cultura cubana tiene como núcleo duro la lucha constante por la independencia y la libertad, ora individual, ora colectiva. Y estos espacios, como aquí vivimos, como aquí se desarrolla nuestra vida, pues entonces hemos decidido echar nuestra suerte en este espacio. Lógicamente, aquí hay cosas que tienen muy poco que ver con militancias y que tienen que ver incluso hasta con visiones poéticas y místicas de la vida. Me viene a la mente ahora aquel decir de Eliseo Diego cuando dijo que uno no nace en un sitio por azar, sino para dar testimonio. Entonces, ¿cómo dar testimonio desde un lugar que es doblemente desconocido o que sufre el impacto en dos vías de un desconocimiento y de una conculcación? Porque por otro lado vivimos en un país del tercer mundo, en un país que es, como se llama, asediado, en un país que es desconocido, en un país que es bloqueado, que es lastimado. Pero también vivimos en una zona que padece hacia lo interno, parece esos mismos esquemas, no quizás por besania o por maldad, sino también por resultado de esos procesos internacionales, y también porque el hombre vive como piensa y no, piensa como vive y no vive como piensa. Y cuando uno tiene resueltos sus problemas, bueno, pues le preocupan poco o se puede distanciar de aquellos que sufren esta realidad. Así pues, nos llamó la atención qué podemos hacer para resolver este problema. Y vino en nuestra ayuda algo que no podíamos tener a la mano cuando reinaba en nuestro espacio el invento de Gutenberg. Vino la tecnología, la computación y especialmente el software libre. En el 2005 vimos, primero conocíamos de Wikipedia, después, de Encarta, de la Enciclopedia Británica y finalmente de Wikipedia. Pero ninguno de estos proyectos nos permitía tener el control de nuestra realidad, o por lo menos de contar nuestra realidad, de hacerla pública, de nuestros sentimientos, desde nuestras visiones y de nuestra construcción de nuestra realidad. Y vino el software libre entonces a ayudarnos en eso. Por suerte, ayer se hablaba del papel extraordinario de la educación en Cuba, y la educación en Cuba nos permitió tener ingenieros, técnicos, historiadores, escritores que, podrían construir entre todos, y podíamos construir entre todos algo que decidimos llamar enciclopedias. Así fue que nació un primer proyecto construido en Manzanillo, incluso antes de que se construyera Ecurret. Y para que ustedes vean, y hablaba ayer de por qué el taxista le hablaba del bloqueo interno. Bueno, para poder llevar, terminamos recientemente en el año 2021, en plena pandemia, terminamos la enciclopedia de Yara. Ahora trabajamos en la enciclopedia de Bartolomé Masó, porque yo creo que los que somos apartados, colonizados o desconocidos tenemos que solidarizarnos entre nosotros mismos. Y sí, a los colegas de Bartolomé Masó les faltan las herramientas, les faltan los métodos, les falta el personal para construir sus enciclopedias. Tenemos que solidarizarnos entre nosotros, los subordinados, para poder entonces hacer visible nuestra verdad. Y estamos trabajando en la construcción de la enciclopedia de Bartolomé Masó. Pero fíjense ustedes, han pasado 15 años en los que hemos estado demostrando, sugiriendo, proponiendo, clamando a las estructuras de poder a nivel nacional para que nos escuchen sobre un proyecto que está aprobado, que es de utilidad para el país. Hemos tenido que escribirle 6 veces al presidente de la República. Menos mal que hay un hombre que entiende de tecnología en la presidencia de la República, y después de 15 años entonces, y a partir de nuestro clamor, escucho me viene a la mente la visión de Walt Disney cuando decía que a veces la diferencia entre ganar o perder consiste en no abandonar. Y no abandonamos. ¿Por qué? Porque de nada vale llorar con la leche derramada. El que migra sí tiene todo su derecho y toda su libertad, pero ¿quién resuelve nuestros problemas si nos cansamos o si emigramos? ¿Quién los va a resolver? ¿Los que nos desconocen? ¿Los que nos colonizan? No, tenemos que resolverlo nosotros y no achacarle la culpa a los demás, sino buscar nosotros las soluciones. Creo que es un elemento indispensable asumir, y entonces desde ese proceso que le llamamos pensar globalmente, pero actuar localmente. Y aquí nos anima un proyecto patriótico, un proyecto que, ¿qué cosa es el patriotismo? Es amar a la patria, es de ser para ella todo su bien. Pero ¿qué es la patria para todos nosotros? ¿O qué es la patria para nosotros? Los que vivimos en este espacio de la Cuba profunda, no del interior, porque eso es un espacio de desconocimiento. Porque si nosotros vinamos al este de Cuba, pues el interior serían ellos. Además, el sol sale por aquí y por allá se oculta. El interior es género de ginecólogos y proctólogos. Nosotros vivimos en la Cuba profunda, un préstamo que le hemos tomado al antropólogo mexicano Bonfil Batalla, y entonces creamos desde aquí las enciclopedias. Aquí está mostrando la enciclopedia de los anales de la unidad de Guantánamo. Conocemos a la unidad, conocemos a Morlote, conocemos a los grandes pintores y artistas, que muchos son de la Cuba profunda y han ido a La Habana a buscar canales de promoción para visualizar su obra. Bueno, pues, ¿cómo podemos hacer nosotros los intelectuales de aquí podemos, y aquí entonces, y eso se lo tenemos que agradecer a la unidad que aprobó y puso los dineros para un proyecto que pretende recoger en el mismo lugar de creación la obra de los intelectuales. Pon otro de las presentaciones de la... aquí tenemos, por ejemplo, el padre, el que nos hizo hombres a los cubanos. ¿Y por qué nos hizo hombres? ¿Porque partió allí? No, porque ese día nos hizo libres. Y entonces nadie mejor que bayameses, que manzanilleros, que todos los granmenses para hablar del padre de la patria. Hicimos la enciclopedia en el 2009. Lo hicimos en el 2009. Convencimos a los que trabajan en la casa natal de Carlos Manuel de Céspedes y en el Bicentenario hicimos una enciclopedia que tiene aproximadamente 4,5 gigabytes de información. El que quiera conocer sobre el padrastro Carlos Manuel tiene que venir a consultar esa enciclopedia en el cual se compendia toda la labor de los cubanos, de los historiadores, investigadores, poetas, incluso hasta los adversarios, porque aquí están artículos donde se denota a Céspedes por parte de los españoles. Claro, no lo podían aplaudir, por supuesto, está aquí. También otra presentación, aquí está, lógicamente, para nosotros la figura hermosa y extraña, porque hay una mezcla de fiereza y de ternura de Celia Sánchez, es para nosotros importante en toda esta región. Hay que ver a cuánto campesino, a cuánta mujer, a cuánto niño atendió Celia Sánchez. Por ejemplo, Celia, yo que soy archivero, por ejemplo, Celia, sin ser archivera, la pasión de Celia por preservar toda la documentación de la etapa de insurrección en el año desde el 53 hasta el 58 y la creación por parte de ella de la Oficina de Asuntos Históricos del Consejo de Estado, merecía por su humanismo, por su vocación, por su voluntad de servicio, merecía entonces también una enciclopedia. Los compañeros de la Oficina de Asuntos Históricos fueron receptivos a nuestro clamor, que no cayó en este sentido, y aquí está la enciclopedia de Celia Sánchez Manduley para el conocimiento de la vida de esta extraordinaria mujer. Aquí tenemos la enciclopedia cultural de Manzanillo. Cuando decimos cultural, nos referimos a las expresiones del arte y la literatura, porque el primer proyecto que salió de aquí fue la enciclopedia de Manzanillo, la primera de una ciudad cubana. Y porque tenemos mentalidad de luchar, porque tenemos mentalidad de que el bien es para todos. Bueno, pues entonces le hemos propuesto al país y después de 15 años, por suerte, ya empezamos a tratar de brindar a todos en Cuba, porque lo mismo que debe suceder con Manzanillo, con Bartolomé Mazó, pasa lo mismo con Matahambres en Pinar del Río, o con Colón en Matanza, o con Guaymaro en Camagüey, o con Floro Pérez en Holguín, o con Mella en Santiago de Cuba, o Palma Soriano, o con Santi Espíritu, o con La Sierpe, con cualquiera de estos espacios de la Cuba profunda, también, ¿cómo se llama? Necesitan de estas herramientas para hacer valer su verdad, su historia y su cultura. Y entonces, demostrando eso, creando con nuestras propias manos, bueno, hemos estado tratando por todos los medios de luchar contra los poderes de desconocimiento, de conculcación y de apartamiento de una cultura. Hemos dicho que la cultura cubana brilla por igual desde todos los espacios de la ínsula. Y termino con una frase que para mí resulta paradigmática. Decía José Martí 3 meses antes de morir: cada hombre se ha de poner a la obra del mundo a lo que tiene más cerca. No porque lo suyo sea más fino o virtuoso que lo ajeno, sino porque el influjo del hombre se ejerce mejor y más naturalmente en aquello que conoce y de donde le viene inmediata pena o gusto. Aquí, en este lugar que conocemos, que vivimos, que sufrimos, que amamos, nos viene inmediata pena o gusto. Y desde aquí, como decía Eliseo Diego, debemos dar nuestro testimonio para nosotros, para nuestros compatriotas y para nuestros hijos. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Delio. Les dejo aquí en la última página. Delio está a cargo de desarrollar, junto con Arturo, el blog de la Universidad. Bueno, voy a dejar el aplauso. El blog de la Universidad de Nottingham. El blog de la Universidad de Nottingham, donde estamos intentando, ustedes pueden entrar y ver, se llama Understanding Cuba, pero dentro de eso hay una sección llamada La Cuba Profunda, donde ustedes pueden entrar y ver que están ellos armando las secciones de cada provincia. Para nosotros es un recurso muy importante. Para investigadores que no pueden viajar a Cuba o que van a Cuba y siempre van a lo mismo, es un recurso muy importante reconocer las muchas Cubas que existen y la sabiduría que podemos recibir de parte de ellos. Bueno, Delio, un milagro que hayas podido
Sí, claro.
estar, hablar, quedarnos con nosotros, como si estuvieras al lado, se te escucha perfectamente, como si estuvieras en la casa de al lado. Ha sido magnífico. Y ahora, bueno, vamos a pasar la palabra a comentarios. We're going to have questions, comments, español, inglés, como quieran. Rosie, adelante. And Alex.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, lovely. So it's a really practical question in terms of ways of publishing for Cuban writers, particularly Cuban writers, and I'm thinking academics in particular, internationally. So, like, the space that you guys are creating through the People Lang series is incredible, the online space that Delio is creating. But I'm aware that there's lots of Cuban academics, particularly in the local universities, who are under a lot of pressure to publish, and to publish in very recognized international journals that are on all the kind of the databases. So I'm thinking about this from the kind of decolonizing angle, that sometimes work produced by Cubans that is of excellent quality gets rejected or doesn't fit the brief of international journals because of features that are stylistic, that are linguistic, that are to do with how the papers are structured. And so there's a dynamic there if we're supporting Cuban writers to be published in terms of how far should they be adapting their work to fit those journals, because that feels like a colonizing process in itself, that yes, you can write for our journal, but you have to translate things into our theoretical frameworks and into our kind of style. So it's a practical problem that I've been dealing with, but it seems to fit really well with your ideas as well.
You're right. All I can say is yes. I don't have an answer. Yes, you're absolutely right. And it's disturbing, and I find it quite disturbing actually to see that not just in Cuba, but in many parts of the world, there is increasingly one or a handful of models that are recognized as research. And often it can be disguised as being a global view or an international view, and actually it's very provincial, that if a reader or a reviewer doesn't recognize the name of the theorist, or doesn't recognize the concept, or doesn't know where the place is, that can often be an obstacle to publication. All I can say is that work is necessary, isn't it? Cubans do have to show that they're internationalizing their research. So it's certainly not to say that they should consign themselves to the local and the provincial or even the national, but that those things should coexist. So a consciousness of what that is for, I guess, isn't it? It's a kind of a meta language of why we're doing this, or a meta consciousness of why we're doing this. Must be the only way of guarding against yet more colonization of minds, right? It's all I can suggest. It's against, it's pissing into the wind, if you want to say, but do you want to suggest anything else?
Yes, thank you for that introduction about pissing into the wind. But yes, I think I'm the person least ready to recommend the internet, except that Delio has shown how you can use the internet to your advantage. I think that throughout the pandemic, the way that the Cubans responded by using the internet is, I think, quite instructive. In other words, you actually do find ways of using it to your advantage. And I begin to be persuaded that that may well be an answer, and that perhaps the one part of the decolonization is to decolonize the internet, is actually to say the way you start to do things locally, you've got that capacity, so that's your publication. Now, of course, it won't be recognized internationally, but you can somehow try and force the issue by making it clear that people are reading it. And if people are reading it, then it's got some sort of prestige and some sort of value. I'm just not sure, but I think that that may be one of the answers.
Maybe it's a case of duplication. Maybe there needs to be an official publication that you make compromises on what you're saying and an additional space to put forward the other version.
Yep.
Who knows? Yep. Two other people. Alex, I think, first of all.
So Alex, Arnold, and then Enrique.
Yep.
Alex, adelante.
Gracias, buenos días. Hoy sin cámara. Quería agradecer mucho estas dos ponencias porque nos traen la necesidad de decolonizar muchas cosas. Y yo creo que nosotros debemos pensar seriamente en la noción de decolonización. Pensar qué cosa es decolonización. He disfrutado mucho escuchar las ponencias y creo importante destacar que decolonizar no es simplemente establecer una relación de independencia con un colonizador. Las colonizaciones que sufrieron nuestros pueblos fueron por siglos, y la colonización no se expresa solo en una relación política entre partes, sino que eso configura nuestras subjetividades y las reproducimos en nuestras relaciones cotidianas. Y eso es lo que hace que hoy estemos ante esa relación de centro-periferia que ubica a La Habana como si fuera el país, que ubica a La Habana como si fuera toda la nación, pero que se reproduce también en las relaciones cabeceras municipales, municipios, en las relaciones cabeceras provinciales, municipios, en las relaciones cabeceras municipales y los poblados que conforman los municipios. Las estamos reproduciendo constantemente en las maneras de pensar, en las maneras de actuar, en cómo se distribuyen las riquezas, en cómo se distribuyen los permisos, en cómo se distribuyen los accesos. Y por otro lado, esta noción yo creo que se ha mostrado también y que no solo aquí, sino en otras ponencias, cómo no podemos esperar que en nuestras investigaciones encontremos una única manera de reflejar la realidad, que no vamos a encontrar, como se ha mostrado aquí también, digamos, una línea continua, homogénea y única que responda automáticamente, que sea una reproducción literal de lo que se espera o de lo que nosotros imaginamos o de lo que imagina un determinado contexto. Hay una diversidad en las respuestas, inclusive de una misma persona, y eso es importante entenderlo para evitar el romanticismo del que se ha estado hablando, porque romantizar es esperar que todo el mundo piense igual. Romantizar es esperar que la respuesta y la noción de ser cubano, de ser revolucionario, de ser comprometido sea única, y hay una diversidad de maneras de expresar nuestra historia, de escribir, de construirnos como nación, que debe ser esperada en los estudios, como resultado esperado de lo que buscamos en las investigaciones, y eso también es importante en esa noción de colonización. Yo recordaba mientras ustedes hablamos algunas frases que tenemos en Cuba como fatalismo geográfico, que las usamos nosotros mismos, los que estamos en la fatalidad geográfica, para justificar muchas veces lo que hacemos o lo que dejamos de hacer. Y por ejemplo, yo pensando aquí, para concluir, yo creo que debería existir un canal de televisión en Cuba solo dedicado a transmitir 24 horas la producción de la televisión serrana, que es la mejor producción de televisión que existe en Cuba, que retrata la realidad del país como ninguna otra televisión. Y creo que debería dedicarse un canal 24 horas a esa producción, que es lo más genial que puede haber en producción audiovisual en Cuba, como una forma de mostrar esa producción que existe fuera de ese centro hegemónico y que es necesario para que repensemos nuestra forma de entender Cuba, nuestras investigaciones y la forma de entender nuestras realidades particulares. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Alex. Si puedo responder rapidito, es una tarea importante para los cubanos, pero es una tarea aún más importante para nosotros. Nosotros que tenemos el acceso al poder, a la voz tan fácilmente, tenemos la responsabilidad mayor de intentar descolonizar nuestras propias mentes y nuestras acciones. Pasando a Arnold y después a Enrique. Pero gracias por el comentario. Y Delio, también puedes contestar, ¿eh? No te sientas... ¿Quieres decir algo? Bueno. Arnold, adelante.